Hello everybody, this is Georgianne Hughes with The Bite Show, and plenty of data for your head. This is part 2 of The Hidden Faces of Terrorism with Paul Collins. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I pick up where we left off here with bin Laden and Russia and all of this. This is very interesting.
Sure. Well, as I said last time, the evidence suggests that bin Laden was being funded for other reasons outside of the crusade against communism.
And all of this is being paid for by the American taxpayer.
Mm-hmm. It was being paid for on our dime. But
just like the school books for the Afghanistani children.
Yeah.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, exactly.
Ooh. Yeah.
But the Central Intelligence Agency was cooking the books as far as the reports that they were supposed to give to President Reagan. The Soviet military power reports were painting the Soviet military and technological capabilities as being just some kind of juggernaut, when in fact the bricks of in the wall were starting to fall on top of their heads. And so they hid this fact from President Reagan so that funding of Osama bin Laden would still be justified because he was needed to fight the communist scourge, and that was the pretext. And all. Now, as we see, given the fact that he was totally, completely obsolete when it came to the anti-communist campaign, he was obviously being funded and kept alive and shepherded for other reasons, reasons that would not become obvious until we were out of the Cold War era.
Right.
And one sector of the establishment that had something to gain from the creation of Al-Qaeda and keeping Al-Qaeda alive and keeping Osama bin Laden alive was the intelligence community. And to qualify this statement, I'd like to direct the audience to former CIA man Robert Baer's book, See No Evil, which the movie Syriana is based loosely on. In that book, a reporter friend of Robert Baer tells him that one of the highest-ranking CIA officials had said to him off the record that September 11th would be seen as a triumph for the intelligence community and not a failure. So, in other words, the intelligence community would gain something from the September 11th attacks and not lose something. So, what was the real motivation behind the Central Intelligence Agency creating the bin Laden network? I believe that you can find the answer to that question in a book by the former Central Intelligence Agency Associate Deputy Director of Operations, Theodore Shackley, a book that he wrote that is near impossible to get, called The Third Option. And in that book, Shackley says, quote, "Senior intelligence officers like myself who had experience in paramilitary operations have always insisted that the United States should also consider the third option, the use of guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency techniques, and covert action to achieve policy goals. Political warfare is very often the stitch in time that eliminates bloodier and more costly alternatives," unquote.
Yeah.
That is what September 11th was.
Yeah.
It represented Shackley's third option being manifested. Bin Laden's connections to our intelligence community seems, in my mind, to reinforce that contention. Another individual who has written a book that reinforces this contention is Michael Levine, who is a former DEA agent. In his book, The Triangle of Death, Michael Levine talks about a conversation that took place between him and a CIA agent. And this discussion seems to suggest that the CIA would be willing to use Shackley's third option right here in the United States, and not just in Latin America or Central America or Africa or somewhere like that. Most people, left-wing researchers in particular, when they think of the third option, they think of somewhere like Angola. They think of somewhere like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
They do not think of the United States. This discussion that takes place in The Triangle of Death by Michael Levine shows that they're willing to use the third option here in the United States. And I'll read this discussion to you. It begins with the CIA agent. The CIA agent begins off, "How can you be so good at what you do and have so little understanding of what really pulls your strings? Don't you realize there are factions in your government that want this to happen? An emergency situation too hot for a constitutional government to handle?" And then Levine says, "To what end?" So the CIA spook responds, "A suspension of the Constitution, of course. The legislation is already in place, all perfectly legal. Check it out yourself. It's called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Turn in your guns, you anti-government rebel rousers. And who would be king, Michael?" And Michael's response is CIA. And the CIA certainly did become king in the post-9/11 world. The triumph for the intelligence community that Baer talked about in his book, See No Evil, is this complete rollback that we see in the intelligence reforms that were stemming from the Church and Pike committees during the 1970s. If you'll remember 1976 being the infamous year of intelligence, when all these nasty revelations started to come out about the Central Intelligence Agency and their involvement in the assassination of different political leaders in other nations and their involvement domestically and all the different intelligence crimes that they had been committing. All of the reforms that came out of the Pike and Church committees to prevent such abuses of power are now being done away with. They've been done away with through the U.S. Patriot Act, which came shortly after September 11th. And if your audience will recall, all the way back at the beginning of this discussion, I talked about revolutionary parliamentarianism, and I said that step 4 was when those in government, those people infiltrated in government, the prostitutes of the power elite, begin to placate the mob that's been created below by introducing some oppressive legislation.
You know, I have never talked to anybody that thought that the Patriot Act was a good idea. It is against the law to murder people, and that's all you need to know.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
They don't need all this crap. And as far as the, this big issue about spying on people, on their telephones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Way back, there was this Project P415. Mm-hmm. They've had Echelon in place for years. The Clinton administration was involved in it. This business of spying on the American people has been going on for a long, long time.
Yes, it has. Yes, it has. With the Patriot Act, it represents step 4 of that whole revolutionary parliamentarianism strategy that I described. And I guess a little bit off, but not too much. You mentioned Echelon. In the new book, Philip and I talk about the fact that Echelon was, in all likelihood, used in the latest NSA spy scandal, the spy on the spy on people.
Yeah.
And the problem with things like Echelon, the problem with things like Promise Software, which was stolen from Bill Hamilton's Inslaw company by Edwin Mises' Justice Department. And he's been in a 20-plus year legal battle to try to get the money that's due him for that software and all the different modified versions that have come out since then. The problem with these tools is that they are technological tools that make the carceral state almost absolute. Foucault talked about the carceral state. He talked about the panoptic schema.
Yeah.
When he spoke about it, he spoke about all the different measures and strategies put forward by social scientists, by people in the social sciences, sociologists. He could have never imagined, however, the idea that of the carceral state being perfected by moving beyond social scientists to the realm of technology.
Yeah.
In the realm of technology, you can actually know where a person is, what they're doing, every minute of every hour of every day,
Yeah.
of every year, from cradle to grave, from womb to tomb. And this is leading to the emergence of what is known as a panoptic singularity, panopticon singularity, which is basically where Foucault's carceral state becomes absolute and all-powerful through technology, and that's where we are basically headed with programs like Echelon, and I'm convinced that Echelon was in all likelihood used in the latest NSA eavesdropping scandal that came out shortly before before the end of 2005 in the press. But that's something to continue to look at very carefully. But I guess I digress. But anyways, the Patriot Act basically changed the FBI's primary mission. The FBI's primary mission prior to September 11th was solving crimes. After September 11th, its mission became gathering domestic intelligence under the Patriot Act.
And by the way, they're very selective in what crimes they solve.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. It's what's known as selective enforcement.
Yeah.
We see this time and again, where we saw this even prior to September 11th, where citizen militia groups were being spied on and surveilled by the Bureau. Meanwhile, Dave Frasca, the head of the radical fundamentalist unit at the FBI, was squelching every single investigation, about 5 investigations into Al-Qaeda, and in particular, Robert Wright's investigation and Colleen Rowley's investigation. And I said this already in part 1, but it bears repeating. For his part in this whole thing, for his selective enforcement, Dave Frasca was not fired. He was promoted after September 11th.
Kind of like Juan Horiuchi at Ruby Ridge.
There you go. There you go. Exactly the same kind of thing. In that Waco, the ATF members that were involved in that were not prosecuted. They didn't face really any kind of nothing serious. A slap on the wrist.
Well, they're going to face something serious in the next world.
Of course. Well, spiritual ramifications, of course, you have to take into consideration.
Right.
But when you're supposedly in this plane of existence, supposed to be in a society that exist under the rule of law, you'd appreciate seeing that being applied to everyone equally.
Yeah.
And that we did not see with Waco, and we did not see it with Ruby Ridge, and it's a travesty that, and now the bills are coming home. It's time to pay the bills, and everybody's going to get to pay.
Yeah.
At any rate, under the Patriot Act, the Treasury Department was given the authority to build a financial intelligence gathering system. And that financial intelligence gathering system could be accessed by the Central Intelligence Agency. And a very important thing to realize is that the Central Intelligence Agency is not supposed to be involved in anything domestic. This was a result of revelations concerning the Central Intelligence Agency's MH Chaos program, which was a domestic counterinsurgency program, kind of like the FBI's COINTEL program. Well, the CIA, under the Patriot Act, had the authority to influence FBI surveillance operations. And these operations would be operations inside the United States. And these operations are basically carried out for the benefit of federal grand juries. And the Central Intelligence Agency would be allowed to basically have an influence, a sway over the way the FBI conducted those surveillance operations. The Patriot Act also allowed the Central Intelligence Agency access to the federal grand jury. Grand juries, most people don't realize this. If you aren't a student of American jurisprudence, you won't be able to appreciate the importance of a grand jury. They are probably the single most important investigative tool that federal law enforcement has in its bag of tricks, so to speak, because a grand jury has the power to gather evidence in secret. They have the power to gather testimonies. They have the power to get their hands on phone records, on your medical records, on your records at your business. The Patriot Act allowed the FBI to take this information, this grand jury information, and basically hand it over to the Central Intelligence Agency. Furthermore, they could give this grand jury information to the agency without even seeking a court order, as long as that information was involved foreign intelligence or involved what they called terrorism. But then again, the definition of terrorism and international terrorism has become so elastic that it could mean just about anything.
Yeah.
And then this information could be spread out all over the national security establishment and shared with everybody. It should also be noted that under the Patriot Act, the CIA, who has forever and a day been totally restricted from any domestic kind of policing work of any sort, and is absolutely prohibited from surveilling American citizens, is now allowed to work with federal agents who do have authority within the domestic realm. Intelligence officers now get to work with intelligence intelligence officers from the CIA now get to work with those that have a domestic investigative authority. So, what we're seeing here is basically a return to the days of MH chaos, the days where the Central Intelligence Agency was conducting domestic projects, and it's all courtesy of the Patriot Act, which represents step 4 of the whole revolutionary parliamentarianism process.
Why would the senators and congressmen, I mean, are they brain dead, or are they part of the problem?
The problem with Congress is that they feel that they are totally subdued, and they could be correct in that assertion in some respects. You might recall several years back there was a man named James Traficant.
Oh yes.
James Traficant, when he tried to do away with the IRS, which is unconstitutional.
Yes, it is unconstitutional.
Yeah,
you're right.
It is unconstitutional. And when he took an unpopular position on certain other things, such as Waco, such as Ruby Ridge, such as America doing trading and technology transfers with the Chinese.
Yes, Clinton gave away a lot of our high tech.
Yeah.
To the communist Chinese.
Yep. The Lipo group, all of that.
Yeah.
All of that stuff that went on there. When he took a position that was unpopular with the establishment on these issues, he found his skeletons being dragged out of the closet. And there's some question as to whether his skeletons were really skeletons at all, and if the charges were not just trumped up. The man found himself in prison, and so far as I know, he's still in prison.
Yeah, he's a political prisoner. Yeah.
Cynthia McKinney lost her seat for a while and finally got it back. But now after this recent incident with the striking of this security officer, the heat could begin to be applied on her once more. Bob Barr found himself under intense scrutiny for taking the position that he took concerning the Patriot Act. So these men aren't stupid. These people on the Hill are not dumb. People in Congress and people in the Senate. They know that if they take a position that is unpopular, that individuals that have their fingers in the different enforcement arms of the government can crack the whip, so to speak. The Justice Department has, for several years now, acted as really little more, in my estimation, than contract men for whatever elite has a beef with somebody. They prostitute themselves out in that way, and basically make themselves available as hired contract men for the oligarchs, for the elites. And so I see Congress as being almost totally, completely subdued. I will point out a few people there that are still doing their best. One being Ron Paul. Ron Paul from Texas is probably the best representative that this country has ever had.
Look at Tom Tancredo. He's also an excellent.
Well, Tom Tancredo has been good on some issues. I will say that Mr. Tancredo has been influenced by certain parties that he shouldn't be influenced by, and we can go into that when we get into the illegal immigration issue down the road.
Okay.
And all. But he himself has been duped on these issues. He's not consciously involved in something evil. But he's kind of turned a blind eye to certain anti-immigration people that are trying to form a racist fifth column within the immigration reform movement, such as John Tanton, who himself receives funding from an elite, Richard Mellon Scaife of the Scaife family, and all. That's a totally different 1 to 2 hour talk that we can get into at a later date. But you are correct in saying that he has taken a stance that is unpopular in a lot of respects, and I will agree with Mr. Tancredo on this much. Something has to be done about the illegal immigration problem, and something has to be done right now, because down the track later it could be too late.
That's right.
Especially returning again to the mayor of Salvatrucha 13, MS-13. Those guys have been in contact with Al-Qaeda cells, members of Al-Qaeda.
We have Al-Qaeda-style training camps right here in this country, and various people have gone to their local sheriff. They've driven out there, showed them the locations, and it's like, oh well, so what?
Yeah. Well, with MS-13, they have been involved in some way, shape, or form with some kind of discussion and discourse with Al-Qaeda, and they're illegal immigrants by and large. And it's only a matter of time before these illegal immigrants in the MS-13 group begin perpetrating some kind of domestic terrorism, probably with the help and aid of Al-Qaeda terrorist cells, some kind of support from that terror network.
Yeah.
And also, so I will agree. So once again, I agree with Tancredo on that point, that something has to be done about illegal immigration. Another thing to point out about Congress, other than the fact that they're scared that somebody will crack the whip.
You know, if they're scared of the boss man cracking the whip,
yeah,
they don't belong up there. I'd like to see some men with testosterone at the helm of our country, for God's sakes.
Yeah, it would be nice to see some. It would be nice to see some intestinal fortitude. Period.
You're darn right.
But other than being afraid of somebody cracking the whip, I also believe that they are by and large lazy. They receive too much money, and I'll tell you something. You should, if you're involved in politics as a representative, you should go up there for 1 to 2 terms, then get out.
Exactly.
At a certain point, you've been up there too long, and it starts to affect your way of thinking.
Yeah, it affects your brain.
Yeah.
Right.
Ron Paul, the Republican from Texas, the representative from Texas, pointed out in an article, an excellent article by Kelly O'Meara for Insight magazine, he pointed out that not a single one of those guys read the Patriot Act, and yet they signed it into law.
Yeah,
and all.
right.
They had not even read the thing.
Yeah.
And all.
Well, this is typical.
Yeah.
Very typical.
If you and I, on the microcosm, if we were handed an insurance policy, or a contract for a credit card, or a contract for the purchasing of a home or an automobile, and we just signed it without reading it, that would be considered the height of stupidity. People would be asking us, "What are you smoking?" And they would be justified in doing so.
You're right.
And yet these guys on the macrocosm do what is essentially the same thing, and they're considered heroes for it because they signed the Patriot Act, and because it has the name the Patriot Act, it must be patriotic, it must be American. And that's the mentality.
It is neither patriotic nor is it American.
Yeah,
it's a piece of venomous garbage.
Yeah, but that's the mentality that is out. That's the mentality that is driving the beast, so to speak.
Yes, you're right.
So that's what I think Congress. That's what I think Congress's problem is that they are afraid of the repercussions should they take a certain stance, and they're also lazy.
Yes.
Just a few more on that first one. Being fearful of repercussions. There were examples that were not lost on Congress, such as Louis McFadden. When that man came out against the Federal Reserve, he was the only one that dropped dead at a dinner party from food poisoning.
You're right.
And nobody said a word, but nobody had to. It was unspoken, it was understood. The message was loud and clear.
Well,
Shut up.
Yeah, look at every president, everybody that's tried to get rid of these parasites that run these central banks, this whole shebang that they've got going, this worldwide scam against human beings, they end up dead.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
You either you end up dead, you end up in prison.
Yeah.
I know that Nixon was not a great president, but when Nixon began to make moves, for instance, revelations that were made in a book called Nixon: Abuse of Power, concerning recordings of conversations that took place in the White House.
Well, you know what's going on today makes Nixon look like a kindergartner.
Yeah. Well, but anyways, in that book, Nixon, these conversations, these tape-recorded conversations, were the transcripts of them were printed for the first time in this book. And what in one of these transcripts, in one of these conversations, Nixon is quoted as saying, "I want to get these guys at the Council on Foreign Relations. I want to go after them, and I want to go after the Rand Corporation."
They need to be gone after.
Yeah, and so you see that he was basically turning against the power elite at that point in time, and all. So what happened? It ended up that they were going to bring him to trial and impeach him for something that is common in American politics. That spying on one another, parties spying on one another, happens all the time.
Oh my goodness, yes.
You know, so it's really a minor political occurrence.
Right.
But they were going to impeach him over this.
You know, and they blow it up to the public, and the people, the average people, are so stupid, they think, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know,
I forget who it was, but somebody that was related to Roosevelt, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I can't remember who it was. I want to say Curtis B. Dahl, but I don't remember if it was him offhand. But there's the temptation to say it was him. But somebody that was related to Roosevelt said when Watergate broke, he said, "I don't know what the big deal is." As somebody that knew Roosevelt intimately, I can tell you that he was doing this all the time.
Yeah.
He was spying on his opposition all the time. The reason that they started this impeachment was not because they were concerned about the president the rumblings for impeachment began. They didn't even get that far. But the reason that they began to talk about impeachment and began to blast the Nixon for Watergate was not because they were concerned about spying. It was because he was beginning to turn against the elite. And that came out in these conversations in that book, that he said, I want to go after the Council on Foreign Relations, I want to go after the Rand Corporation. And he was also making moves against the International Monetary Fund. And the funny thing is the point is, going back to what you were saying, whenever somebody tries to turn against the power elite, they're attacked. And the funny thing is that Nixon could have won an impeachment hearing. He could have won, and I'll tell you how. At that time, there was evidence that the DNC was receiving money from Cuba and from other foreign governments.
Say what DNC means.
The Democratic National Committee. The Democrats were receiving money from Cuba, and they were receiving money from other foreign sources. I mean, people talk, today about, the DNC and Chinagate. That's been going on for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
They've been receiving money from foreign sources forever and a day.
Yes.
Nixon could have used this fact, that there was a body of evidence pointing towards Cuba giving money to the Democrats. He could have used this fact as a pretext to justify the break-ins at the Watergate. He could have said that this was for the purpose of national security. I had to know, were they taking money from Cuba? It's under a communist dictator, after all, So he could have very easily won any kind of impeachment hearing, just like Clinton won. He could have, and with his re-election, he won overwhelming. He won overwhelming over everybody. All the different candidates there. So he would have had popular support going into that whole thing. Two people, however, were pressuring him to resign the presidency instead of taking on impeachment. One was a high-up operative in the Republican Party known as George Herbert Walker Bush, saying, you need to quit and all. The other one was a close advisor, Henry Kissinger, telling him you need to quit.
Yeah.
And everything. And so...
Well, Kissinger he's a snake.
Oh, yeah. He's very much so. And again, I mean, it's a discussion for later on down the trail.
Yes.
But he was involved in the whole depopulation thing going back to part one of this discussion. He was a primary architect in the National Security Study Memorandum 200, which basically said that population growth in non-white countries constituted a national security threat to the United States. So depopulation measures had to be taken in those countries. The funny thing is that the countries that came up were countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, countries that were made up of non-white populations. Mm-hmm. So, going back to the racism of the power elite.
And then they send the WHO and the CDC over there and vaccinate everybody. Very interesting.
Yep. That's that. I mean, and it's funny how when the World Health Organization vaccinated over in Africa, how we had AIDS begin to spring up.
Oh yeah.
I don't believe that to be an accident.
No, it was not an accident.
But this is something that we've seen back on the topic of terrorism. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen this whole strategy recycled, where an enemy is created and then that enemy is used as a pretext for bringing out draconian measures on the population. In World War I, we had the Espionage and Sedition Act. And what that basically said, in a nutshell, was you say something against the government, you get thrown in jail. And believe it or not, there's sedition laws still on the books with several states.
Yeah, well then, if those sedition laws are still on the books, how come a lot of the elected representatives haven't been locked up?
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Well, once again, the rule of law has been circumvented because the law only applies to certain people.
That's right.
Then in World War II, we had Korematsu versus the U.S., that famous case that went to the Supreme Court. And they basically found that Japanese citizens that were Americans, they said that they had to be placed in internment camps. And they were, even though their loyalties were to the United States. We had, during the Cold War, we had the Smith Act in 1996. As a result of the OKC bombing, we had the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And by the way, with the OKC bombing, Timothy McVeigh was planning that at a white separatist compound known as Elohim City. The head of that little commune, actually, that white separatist commune, was a man named Reverend Millar. Reverend Millar admitted in a Tulsa, Oklahoma courtroom that he was an FBI informant. McVeigh was also working with a man named Dennis Mahan, who bragged to Ambrose Evans Pritchard that he was receiving protection from the federal government. And he also was working with a man named Andreas Straussmeyer, who was part of German intelligence and was here on loan to our government. And his father was Gunther Straussmeyer, who was a mover and shaker in the German government. And after certain investigative journalists for, I believe, the Soldier of Fortune magazine began to look into Straussmeyer and into his background, Straussmeyer left the States. And so, you know, there's, and then it also came out, the prosecution had on the stand in the trial against McVeigh, the prosecution brought up his sister, and his sister admitted that McVeigh had told her rather, that he was involved in a special forces group that was involved in criminal activity.
Well, you know, it's interesting because now I believe that I have this correctly. I'm not, you know, who can say today, but Timothy McVeigh worked for a company by the name of CalSpan. And CalSpan was involved in some kind of implant technologies. And if you'll remember, McVeigh kept saying that he had been...
Yeah, he had one... He said that he had an implant in his buttock.
Yes.
Yep. See, there's all this evidence that seems to point towards government provocateurs being behind that whole thing in 95. And then, as a result of the OKC bombing of the Murrah building in 95, we got the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 96.
Well, you know what's interesting? I wish people out there listening could see. Government kills people. It always has. You know, going back into the Old Testament. I mean, government, it seems to be, that's their primary function, is to kill people.
Well, I'll say this, a particular kind of government. a particular kind of government. Going back into the Old Testament, you go to the prophet Samuel. Samuel gets mad at the Israelites because the Israelites told him that they want a king.
Yeah, right.
And
we've been paying the price for that folly ever since. Yeah.
And so God basically tells Samuel, he says, look, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. So give them what they want, and the king is just going to rule over them, and he's going to have rule over their children, over their livestock, over their property, and it's going to be oppressive, that's the kind of government that we need to avoid. And to prevent going off in an anti-government trajectory, like the militias of the mid-90s did, I'd like to point out that while this is state-sponsored terrorism, that the state itself is being controlled by entities existing above the state. Governments are being controlled by forces above the government, the power elite. The power elite is basically using government as its own personal prostitute.
Yes, you're right.
I'll give you an example. I've talked a lot about the Central Intelligence Agency tonight, and it sounds like I've really demonized them and all. And I think Philip might have pointed this out in a prior discussion with you, but I think it bears repeating. What most people don't understand is that the Central Intelligence Agency has a charter from the government, but it really isn't, by and large, a government entity. The individual who wrote the National Security Act of 1947, which brought the Central Intelligence Agency into existence, was a man named Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford was a big mover and shaker on Wall Street. He was basically one of these Wall Street lawyers. The individuals that supervised Clifford's writing of that act were the Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen.
Oh boy, yeah.
Allen was head of the Schroeder Bank of America, with the American branch, the New York branch of the Schroeder Bank. He was, they were both, as a matter of fact, part of Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell is a tremendously powerful Wall Street firm that had as one of its clients DuPont, at a time when DuPont was shipping munitions to Nazi Germany. Sullivan and Cromwell also represented Enron. So what you got is you have these guys that have loyalty more to private financial interests than they do to the national government.
Right.
There. And basically they created the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Central Intelligence Agency gained its legitimacy through a government charter, but they created it by and large to operate as what Russ Baker of the Village Voice called it, a private army for the Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
Another thing to qualify what I'm saying here, if you look back at when Salvador Allende was kicked out of Chile and was basically assassinated, and Pinochet was put in power there. Salvador Allende was not a great guy. He was a socialist.
Right.
But the problem was that he was threatening two private interests. Well, actually, three private interests that I can think of offhand and all. ITT, Anaconda Copper, and PepsiCo, Pepsi-Cola, and all. He was basically threatening these companies because he was going to nationalize industry and they would lose their monopolies. So all of a sudden, the Central Intelligence Agency gets involved in these covert operations over there that contribute to Allende's downfall and to Pinochet coming to power. So basically, you had the agency acting on the behest of these private corporations, which are the locus of power for the power elite. In this case, ITT, Anaconda Copper, PepsiCo, and all. So what we have here is a situation where legitimate government is being prostituted out to the power elites and is thus being transformed from a republic to an oligarchy. And that's what we have to do. We have to cut the connection between the power elite and the government, and make them receptive to their primary constituents again. Their primary constituents are not the DuPonts. Their primary constituents are not the Rockefellers. They're not the Morgans. They're not the Kennedys or whatever, and all. They are Joe citizen in the street, you and I, and all. They're the middle class and the lower class people, and all. That's who their constituents are, and all. We pay the bills, after all, and all. The power elite don't pay the bills. They get to opt out of the income tax through tax shelters such as tax-exempt foundations that they put their money in, and all. So that's where the problem is. If we want state-sponsored terrorism to end, and all, we have to break the connection between the power elites and our government, because state terrorism is always carried out to benefit the needs of the privileged. But anyways, any other questions that you have?
Wow, what a presentation. My goodness. You know, you're right. It's we the people that make up the constituency. You know, and you're never going to get, unfortunately, 100% of the American people to agree on anything. If it were possible to get them to agree, this power elite could be brought down overnight.
That's true. Now, we have been separated over several different petty issues.
Yeah.
I believe that not to be unintentional, too. I believe that to be very, very much consciously engineered.
Right.
Americans have been programmed to see themselves as being in left-wing and right-wing camps, as being Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives. These are by and large very much superficial labels,
right,
that cause us to have an us-again mentality when it comes to our own neighbors. And the thing is to break that way of thinking. I worked towards doing this in earnest back during the 2004 election. I could see where things were getting very heated. I'm sure that you saw this too. That was a very ugly election.
Yeah.
I mean, people just were on one another.
They don't understand, and I keep saying it over and over. It is one snake with two heads.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
Exactly.
And the people just can't see it.
Yeah. Well, what I saw how ugly it was getting, and so I began to point out how both sides were essentially the same. How both the Kerry camp and the Bush camp were essentially the same. For instance, this cold elitist insensitivity that existed both with the Bush crowd and with the Kerry crowd. We saw this cruel insensitivity when Bush went ahead and executed, when he was governor of Texas, he went ahead and allowed Carla Faye Tucker, a born-again Christian, to be executed. And he even mocked her on television. He mocked her pleas for clemency. He got up and said, "Please don't kill me," and he did it in a very sarcastic imitation way of the woman and all. He had her killed. He did, however, stay the execution of one individual who was involved in a satanic cult and involved in ritual murder, Henry Lee Lucas.
Yeah, they like those satanic ritualistic killers.
Yeah. You know. Now, on the other side, we see that Carrie possessed this exact same kind of elitist insensitivity and cruelty, going back to the days of Vietnam.
Right.
When he was on these swift boats. These swift boats were known for ferrying to and fro assassins that were involved in the Phoenix assassination program. So we know that he was exposed to that whole thing, that whole project, and he probably witnessed some things connected to that and all. But more egregious, we know that he had, during Vietnam and during his time spent over there, 24 confirmed kills. And with these kills, there was no contraband or no weapons found on the individuals that he killed.
Oh boy.
So he possesses this same kind of brutal mean streak as Bush does and all. And that's just one commonality that the two shared. And my point was to people is that you're essentially dealing with two criminal syndicates fighting a turf war. Let them fight one another and let them fight their own fights, and if they can win, good for them, but don't get involved in it, opt out of it.
Right, right. You're right. You're exactly right.
And what I found is that people could not move beyond these superficial camps of liberal and conservative, Democrat, Republican, left and right that they have been in for most of their natural lives. Now, a few of them begrudgingly saw my point, but I get the idea that it didn't affect them one way or the other when they went to the polls and everything. But that's what has to happen here, is that people have to have these superficial divisions broken, so that we stand in a united front against those who would transform America into an oligarchy. And that's basically what needs to happen. It needs to become contagious, so to speak. And so, but is there any other kind of directions that you'd like to, any other kind of things that you'd like to hit with the terrorism topic?
Well, in closing, how do you see this playing out? What is your feeling, Paul? What do you feel that they are prepared to do to keep and maintain their hold?
You mean the power elite?
Yeah.
I think that you can find what they intend to do in documents that came out thanks to James Bamford, who was a former Washington investigative producer for ABC. These long-hidden documents, we have to tip our hats to him for bringing them to the public attention. go all the way back to 1962, and goes back to Lyman L. Limnitzer, who was basically the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He wanted to remove Castro from power in Cuba.
Yeah.
And the problem is that that the American people had to be whipped up into discontent and have to be whipped up into some kind of hostility towards Cuba. The only way to get this done was through a campaign of terrorism.
Yeah.
That plan that he came out with was called Operation Northwoods.
Right.
And basically, it involved sinking boats that carried refugees from Cuba. It included attacks on the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo. It would include attacks on airliners. It would even include attacks, believe it or not, on the American space program. And all. The Northwoods operation also suggested something that was along the lines of the 1898 explosion aboard the battleship Maine. That a ship could be blown up in the U.S. A U.S. ship could be blown up in Guantanamo Bay, and then they could blame it on Cuba. Now, Kennedy, needless to say, was not too keen on this idea and threw it out. He didn't want it. Things were already kind of tense with Cuba, and but what we'll see is a recycling of this plan, in my estimation, with one country in particular, and I believe that to be Iran. Right now, public sentiment is not all that too high as far as going into Iran, but we know that this government very much desires to do so and all. But something's going to happen to galvanize the American people behind such a move and all. After all, people are very much tired as far as things are concerned with Iraq, and they really don't feel like fighting. They feel like bringing the boys home.
Right.
The John Murtha, for instance, brought forward this plan that would get our men out of Iraq. He basically said, look, let's redeploy the men to areas surrounding Iraq, outside of the region, and allow the people to govern themselves, and if things start to fall apart with the political infrastructure, we can just easily move the men back in and all. His plan was ridiculed, even though the man himself was a former military man. He had Murtha had been involved in he had left college to actually fight in the Korean War. Mm-hmm. So he knew from whence he spoke. He had experiential knowledge, and his proposal should have been respected. It was not, and all. But anyways, Iraq has Americans sick and tired of conflict, and we have to be whipped up into hostility again, and the proper kind of propaganda campaign has to take place to get Americans keen on the idea of going into Iran and all. That propaganda campaign would have to, in my estimation, involve acts of terrorism not unlike those that were proposed in Operation Northwoods. And so I think that we can look forward to something happening at some date not too far down the road, terrorism-wise, that would basically get Americans behind the idea, get public opinion behind the idea of going into Iran, because the neoconservative plan doesn't stop with Iraq. the neoconservative plan of a global democratic revolution, which is really nothing more than than Trotsky's Fourth International of permanent revolution, of keeping the revolution going forever.
You're right.
You know,
and people don't realize that.
Yeah, but that whole plan of global democratic revolution and all encompasses the whole world.
Yes.
And so eventually, mass consensus has to fall in line with the idea of going to war in Iraq, and to do that, they might employ some kind of form of terrorism and blame it on Iran or some group connected to Iran or something like that. It would also give them a great excuse to the international community to move into Iran, because right now the neoconservatives are kind of locked out in the respect that Russia and China had some vested interest over there in Iran.
Right.
You know, we know that Russia's been helping them with their nuclear program. Mm-hmm. And so how do we get them to basically support us in the idea of invading Iran? We can't, unless we are able to come to them with some horrible terrorist attack and say, look, Iran did this. We know that you have been collaborating with Iran on these different areas, but now, you know, out of respect for the United States, we ask that you cut it off and that you get supportive. You support us when it comes to some kind of move against Iran, you know, and that's basically what I see somewhere down the line. And hopefully I'm wrong, you know, but chances are is that I'm actually making a very conservative estimation concerning the future.
Do you think that the American people will ever catch on to how this game is played? I know a lot of them out there have, but there's a huge number that have not. I mean, they're just stone cold asleep.
Well, whether or not they catch on, whether or not the majority catch on, it's really, I mean, that would be the desired thing, of course.
Right.
You know, but you got to realize that in this nation's history, that's always been a small minority that's always dragged the breast kicking and screaming to freedom. That's basically rescued the country as a whole.
Yeah.
And the patriot always starts off as a despised person, and
sure.
that's the way that it's always been. That's the way that it probably always will be. I think that there is credence in Jefferson's idea of a natural aristocracy, and he was not saying that he was not spouting the precepts of elitism. He was in some respects an elite, but he was not an elitist. But his idea of a natural aristocracy was this idea that there would always be a small minority that would take the initiative and that would actually stand up and fight for freedom and win the prize of liberty, and the majority would get to enjoy the fruits of the minority's labor. But it's really the minority that earned it, and this minority is made up of normal American citizens that were just patriotic and had the intestinal fortitude to stand up at a time when they needed to, and to do something about it. So whether or not we have a mass awakening, a broad general kind of paradigm shift, so to speak, the minority that does realize what's going on can't be counted out. And, one person can actually be a very powerful force for social change, good and bad.
Yeah.
So we just have to take that into consideration when you look at this whole thing, and don't, of course, at the same time, don't rule out the divine in all of this.
Absolutely.
And I mean, you never rule out God in the equation, because it's kind of funny how he works and who he chooses to work through, and it's usually
and before we close, it is so interesting. All these people will spout God this, God that, but when you want to lift up the name of Jesus Christ, they just cringe.
Yeah, they do.
And that's we need to pray for those people, because there's something wrong with them.
Yep. I'd have to agree with you on that. I try not to become jaded, but at the same point, at the same time, some of these people that you've tried to explain it to over and over again, and they still cringe, I'm getting to the point with those kind of individuals where I feel like saying, well, if I have to explain it, you wouldn't understand anyways.
I understand what you're saying there, and everybody just ought to go read Ezekiel 9. Just read that chapter, and you'll understand what's coming.
Absolutely.
And that guy with the inkhorn, be interesting to see who he visits.
Yep. Yep.
Oh my gosh. Paul, thank you. This has been very, very enlightening and a wonderful presentation that you've done. And we will be back with you and your brother, where our next session will be about population control and peak oil.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
You betcha. And give out the information where people can get your book.
All right. The books can be bought through Barnes & Noble, www.barnesandnoble.com, and Amazon.com. I also want to say once again that a subscription to the ACL report that we write for Michael Corbin would be well worth your while, because we basically talk about a lot of the topics that I've spoke about here, but in greater depth and in a very up-to-date fashion, because there's new information coming out all the time. I know that when it comes to the topic of terrorism, there was just recently the Samara bombing of a mosque over in Iraq, and I'm getting gunned up to talk about that in the report that I'm going to write for the ACL report, and it basically ties in with what we are talking about tonight, but keeping things current. So, I mean, like, it's well worth a subscription at www.4 a closer look, all lowercase, all one word, .com. And that's where you can basically pick them up. I'd also encourage people to probably wait just a little bit longer before you get the Ascendancy and wait for that second edition to come out, because we were writing on it again tonight, and it's standing now at about 669 some pages, and it's about ready to go into about 700, and it's going to be information dense. And it's not going to be the Ascendancy your father drove. This is going to be bigger and a whole lot better. And I just would like people to get geared up for it and look for it to come out soon and purchase that one, because a lot of time and love and energy and effort went into it.
Well, I can stand up and tip my hat to you on that, you and your brother, because the two of you have really put your heart and soul in your work, and you're very good with the details. You explain things very well. You know, people need to get these materials, and you know, they'd make good school books for kids.
That's what I was hoping, is that they would become like textbooks.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. This Mickey Mouse garbage that these schools use, and what passes for education and school books today is just trash.
Well, you're not going to see with my books what you've seen with the books that I had to put up with. I had to put up with books where there was 5 pages over Marilyn Monroe and about 5 paragraphs over George Washington. So
yeah.
So that's not. That's exactly the kind of garbage that we avoided with these books.
Well, so I think these books, like that you and your brother have produced, at some point will be school books.
Hopefully.
Yes. Well, we've reached the end of our motion here on the hidden faces of terrorism, and we will be doing a lot more work with Paul Collins and his brother. And God bless both of you. And
thanks, Georgianne.
You bet. And, you know, just God bless everybody out there that hears these audio files. We offer them for free. The Bite Show exists merely on donations. It is listener supported. You know, we don't really sell anything. So we hope and we pray that all these audio files, the information that has been presented tonight by Paul Collins, the information presented by his brother Philip Collins, and all the others there on the Bite Show library page will be a blessing to all of you out there. So get prayed up, folks. You're going to need it. This is Georgianne Hughes with my very special guest, Paul Collins, signing off. Good night, everybody.